Eulogizing Queen Elizabeth II is a challenging task. In focusing on her passing, it is hard not to get lost in the affliction of grief. As much as she was loved and will be missed, we cannot help but rejoice at her legacy. It is a legacy that will take years to understand. Her 50 years of service to this country alone will take time to process. But the seeds of what she symbolized are being plucked now, and the messages they contain demand reflection. We need to take a step back from the anguish of her farewell and allow our regard for her as a person to mature into an intellectual appreciation for the world that she built without us even realizing it. The structure of this essay is underpinned by Queen Elizabeth II's extraordinary monarchical existence. Assessing her legacy from the points of view of history, spectacle, and constitutional development will create a swirling vortex of context that can help us understand what we have lost, what we have found, and what we have yet to discover. The loss of a 71-year reign signals a rupture with the world into which she was born and which she did so much to shape. For almost a century, she was the only constant in a tempestuous modern history. Her reign was 50 years longer than I am. Until it was gone, there was no living memory of England without Elizabeth II. When Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne in 1952, Britain was still grappling with imperial decline and the physical wreckage wrought by the Second World War. There were few immediate signs that Elizabeth would be an unusually long reigning and successful queen of the country, let alone one around whom to fashion a modern monarchy into the new millennium. And yet, by 2015, she had overtaken Victoria as the longest-serving monarch, much to the surprise of many of those who followed her turbulent early reign. The significance of her decades of public service is captured in the current outpouring of public sentiment in the hours after the announcement of her passing, but also in the representations of some political leaders and in the worldwide television coverage she has received. Queen of 15 different realms, the monarch of the Commonwealth and head of state of 15 different nations, the present-day significance of a woman who reigned between 1950 and 2022 is evident. Whilst the Queen and her advisors have always insisted that the real power and decision-making authority that earlier monarchs possessed resides in her political prime ministers, the British people's identification of her with Britain and the role, meaning, and purpose of the British state and nation in the international system has long been profound. Queen Elizabeth II has been in the public eye for more than 90 years. Her advent from a home with no running water has been a life that has run parallel with some of the most significant events in our nation's and the world's history. Her father, King George VI, was on the throne during the abdication crisis and the Second World War, in which Britain lost more than 450,000 soldiers. He was succeeded by his eldest daughter in the first decade of the Cold War in 1952. The final withdrawal of British military forces in 1956 east of the Suez Canal occurred the year after she became Britain's head of state. During the final months of the 1966 World Cup, it was the Queen who handed over the trophy, but not before a long speech commending the tournament, football generally, and all who have been concerned with its organisation for their hard work and skill. The first and only televised moon landing was in 1969, the year in which the Queen opened the new Royal Opera House in London's Covent Garden. For over 7 decades, Queen Elizabeth II has dedicated herself to public service, defining the essence of her reign as a symbol of stability and change. From the moment she acceded to the throne in 1952, at the age of 25 as a result of the early death of her father, her life has been defined by a sense of duty, guided by a set of inalienable values. Born in 1926, she grew up in London during a time of great change and tumult in Europe. Early on, her father sought to provide her with an upbringing that included a diverse range of experiences and people. An education at home, followed by Eton College and 3 years at the University of Bonn, presented her with a diverse array of ideas and perspectives that shaped her understanding of public service in a modern, dynamic context. But more than any of that, she was left with an understanding that, above all, the noblest freedom allowed to man is his ability to choose to serve others. Princess Elizabeth was never meant to be queen. Born second in line for the throne, she was given an ordinary upbringing, with the exception made for teaching her about service from an early age. After the abdication of her uncle, Albert ascended as king, with Elizabeth becoming the heir presumptive in 1936. The Second World War delayed their wedding and further postponed their journey back to normal. By the age of 56, she had reigned over 37 nations and Commonwealth states before passing the throne to her son, Charles. Her commitment, stability, and integrity had helped the British monarchy adapt and continue to evolve. She was already a symbol, a legacy still very much alive. Queen Elizabeth II was born on April 2, 1926 in London to the Duke and Duchess of York, who became King George VI and Queen Elizabeth in 1936. As a child, Elizabeth loved horses and corgis and shared close relationships with her sister, Princess Margaret, and her parents. They lived simply for royals, though this was partly due to her father's disinterest in ceremony and pomp. Valuing duty and service was nonetheless deeply ingrained in Elizabeth by her parents, who keenly felt the responsibility of their position. She also learned fortitude in the face of adversity. During World War II, she and Margaret lived in royal residences at Balmoral and Sandringham to avoid German bombs. Elizabeth and Margaret's education was intensive and carefully regimented. Like all royal children, they did not go to school. Instead, a succession of tutors came to instruct them in a prescribed series of subjects between riding lessons, piano practice, and games. At an early age, Elizabeth's routine included French, arithmetic, and science, and as time went on, she added on board work with constitutional tutors. These men prepared her to take on the mantle of her father and grandfather. Most important to her learning was the reign of her grandfather, George V, a strong-willed king who instilled her with principles about her duty of service. Elizabeth's 21st birthday speech on the duty of kingship would reflect that influence. The loss of her grandfather, George V, and the abdication of her uncle, Edward VIII, also profoundly shaped her view of the requirements of leadership. She has said that after those events she would never abdicate. She took the throne in 1952 and has held it longer than anyone in British history. In the early hours of Tuesday, February 9, 1952, 25-year-old Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten woke up to make himself coffee, a habit of his before dawn watches. Unknown to him, his life had changed forever. Just a few hours before he got up, his wife's father, King George VI, had died in his sleep. When Princess Elizabeth received the news that she had become the new Queen of England while on an overseas trip to East Africa, she burst into tears. The new Queen Elizabeth II set off for the United Kingdom to meet her family and take on the burden of state. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary of Windsor had become queen after her beloved father's passing. The little-known dream of the girl who had taken the throne after her father's passing was too short. Suddenly he left his second daughter with a country. This quiet and seemingly conservative yet really very friendly girl would come together, both with joy and disappointment, for 69 years. But it was not a girl who stood in front of the cameras for the first time, ready to shoulder her responsibilities, but a mature young woman who had been matured by life. The transition from private citizen to queen came unexpectedly and terribly early, but it was not argumentative. Quite the contrary. When she performed the ceremony wearing the dress worn to her father's birthday ceremony 16 years ago, a sign of respect, albeit mistakenly denied by their grandmother, she already knew two things. First of all, she did not rely on the humane intuition of the Queen. She would do what she had to do, just as her colleagues had done. And second, she would live in her nation's heart until her last breath, earning their respect and love. Thus, in their shocked and tearful eyes, the first seed of the golden renaissance of monarchy was embedded. Lady Elizabeth, who said to the Prime Minister, "Please call the Queen," fulfilled her duty in fear and trembling as a woman. At the same time, she protected the dignity of the crown of her nation. If one of these is missing, the other automatically weakens. Her youth and inexperience teamed up with her to cast doubt. It seemed as if she was fragile in the eyes of the public. In a time when young kingships were tarnishing all over the world, The newly emerged, old-looking but incredibly young queen doomed her people to live under the monarchy for the longest ever. Her reign was undoubtedly the highlight of the history of the constitutional monarchy in the UK. The year 1952 would become a synonym for her reign, and his death for the monarchy itself. This was proof that being a king was a divine mission. That was the very meaning of being a holy, righteous woman. Monarchy referred to ladies and gentlemen and thus made them the Messiah. Her father died of a heart attack at 56 when Queen Elizabeth was still 25 years old. His youngest daughter was anointed at 10 and promised to serve the nation, and I will, she said the following day. Thus, the most satisfying, the greatest, the most difficult, the happiest period of her term had begun. The Secretary-General, the Presidents of the United States of America, the Federal Republic of Germany, France, India and Pakistan, and His Holiness, the Pope paid their respects at King George's funeral. The stone on his coffin bore the following words: Georgius VI, Renatus, 14th December 1895, Mortuus, 8th February 1952, Reginae Elizabethae II Dolores 50. And there the holy righteous king lay. On his right side, separated from Blair, was his daughter. 27 hours after his ousting, she would be crowned England's queen. The morning had just begun. Queen Elizabeth II has had many memorable moments and photographs throughout her reign as monarch of the United Kingdom. The abiding image of her is the bright young princess having a crown put on her head in 1953, the image of continuity and tradition. Key moments in her reign include her first public speech as queen in 1947 to the death of her daughter, Princess Diana of Wales, in 1997. She has been queen for over 70 years, from Winston Churchill to Boris Johnson. The moment for which she will always be remembered is the day of her coronation. The first coronation of the television age was watched by 20 million people in countries such as Britain, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia, across continental Europe, the United States, almost everywhere in the British Empire and beyond. People have nostalgia for the event more than they had at the time, of unity and national identity expressed centre stage in a residential square at a time of stresses and strains. It brought together the old and the new, the refreshingly modern and the anachronistic in an otherwise modern, affluent, up-to-date empire soon to become a Commonwealth of nations. The reign of Queen Elizabeth and the way it was celebrated with her 2 Jubilees was popular history enough for people to write books about her, to the undoubted financial reward of publishers, writers and booksellers. Now, the new age is one in which Queen Elizabeth is obviously adaptable in being a constitutional monarch performing her symbolic role in a bejeweled uniform, maintaining royal tradition while moving with the times. Her showbiz Silver Jubilee versus the more stately and official Golden Jubilee that, amid death and destruction, followed 6 months later after New York's traumatic terrorist attack. Long live our Queen! She will always be with us in print, with openings in public life, in annual ceremonial uses, in regular and consistent periodicity at regular intervals. Long live journalistic continuity, royal, popular or otherwise. Once peace had been restored, a sense of expectancy and excitement filled the world. The death of her beloved father led to the Queen's unexpected and somewhat unprepared entry into a life bound by ceremony and challenge. The coronation, which followed almost 16 months later, changed her life completely. This moment in the history of the British monarchy was an extravagant and grand ceremony that gave the imperial powers of old one last breath. The pageantry and grandiosity kindled a sense of togetherness and brought people out, not only in the thousands to line the route, but across the world on their television sets. The colour, sound and visual stimulants saturated the world's imagination and cemented the coronation's royal eye. It was on the day following her 25th birthday in 1952 that she swore herself to her people and her country. The several months from the death of the king in February to the day of her coronation on the 2nd of June of the following year are described by Elizabeth, a girl of great beauty, blonde and blue-eyed and tall, almost 6 feet in height, as the most difficult time in her life. The early months of her reign were further clouded by the slow progress of her pregnancy and the unwanted manner in which the public had forced her to move into Buckingham Palace. Her coronation, too, was fraught in its preparations with endless intrusion by the government. The Queen was taking on an office that was only just opening up to women in politics. Her private secretary was not willing, for example, to act on the advice of the British government. On advice from them, he refused her the right to address Parliament. She would refuse this attitude and reassert her sovereignty when she finally addressed 3 parliaments in a year before bringing their leaders together at a place of her choosing. Her young age, narrow upbringing, and privileged education to equip her for power could not and would not have lost her the charismatic public attraction of a Catherine in times of trouble. The power behind the throne at this time was not the image, as previously, of the Prime Minister and the representative House of Lords. Reality was controlled by a part of popular imagination that saw the children of a little princess taken into care. Elton links the mourning performances over Queen Victoria's death with the holding of silver and golden Jubilee celebrations. These events show the country, and through extensive reporting, the world, not only that the royal family has a remarkable history, but that Queen Victoria has left her mark on the globe, in the vast size of the population represented in such a view and the origins of settlers still populating the New World. The sovereign's long life and long reign suggests a dream of the British Empire, or in other eyes, an England preserved, but they also symbolize continuity and national change. It was in the ongoing competing aids of peace that the Queen communicated her understanding of her own constitutional and personal development and limits. Queen Elizabeth's meditations on the past 50 years, spoken on the anniversary of her succession, have been the occasion for study in terms of what has been revealed. For at these celebrations, great are the changes in who celebrates, and how and when and how gifts are given and received, and who receives and gives. These public events are occasions where the visibility of the Queen as a mother and wife, as she so frequently and movingly said after the murder in France of her son's ex-wife, mounts and unites a sense of reverence for the dead and fair treatment of the living. Elton observed that for her Silver Jubilee, the people of Britain will delight to watch the mother's face as her goodwill floods out across the face of a child understood or strangers loved. In itself, the Queen said, a Jubilee is a triangle of virtue, the strength of the warmest family, as anniversaries in general were material manifestations of the special or unique character situated only one place and time. In a rare moment of personal reflection transmitted through her writing, not a speech, the Queen did say something of what the Silver and Golden Jubilees felt like to her. In November 1975, speaking of the latter, she said, "As breaking the record and being a point for me as well as for the public, not in the sense of looking towards the future old age to come, but looking back and saying we did it, that it did happen." The monarchy in Queen Elizabeth II's time has been through an era of unprecedented scrutiny and change. Throughout the Cold War and its aftermath, she has navigated shifting political realities and public expectations that persist in their varied and often conflicting messages today. Many say the monarchy has grown increasingly distant and irrelevant, unable to properly address the concerns of the modern age or the values of those it seeks to represent. Evidence of a changing society can be seen through a series of Republican movements that have called for the abolition of the monarchy and its replacement with a distinctively British People's or Republican model. Ranging from the political far left to more broadly liberal elite interests, their critiques variously target the alleged unaccountability of the monarchy, corruption, out-of-touch symbols of power, and an undemocratic House of Lords. These criticisms have been recognised to a greater or lesser extent throughout Elizabeth's reign. Adverse criticism of the royal family has attracted intense media scrutiny. Like all institutions, the monarchy has been shaped by shifting and often contradictory public expectations about the capacity of positions of power to represent the body politic throughout the modern British Isles. Often billed as hard-working and only seeking to serve other people, senior Windsors have continued resolutely to endorse the economic and diplomatic advantages brought by their castles. Indeed, while democratic change was constantly making its mark on prayers for the well-being of the royal family, its castles and navy, the enduring roots of pre-democratic sentiment, can be gauged by the fact that 2-to-1 majorities claimed that the monarchy was relevant and did more good than harm. This is controversial, as the coverage of her recent passing indicates. For every positive comment, there will be a negative to match. Counterpointing these Republicans are those staunch, often socially conservative and elderly royals who fear a new and uncertain constitution packed with crises which may jeopardize the economic future or their social welfare. Ultimately, the future of Queen Elizabeth II's death and legacy is still uncertain. During her reign, there have been moments when it has appeared that the monarchy had a distinctive role. For example, after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1997, when the nation and those abroad who took a particular interest in the British royal family saw how the Queen's personal qualities could help heal a wounded public. Throughout her reign, there have been many other times when it has appeared that the monarchy was being publicly scrutinized for its ostentation, for its expenses, for its privilege, for its inbuilt inequity, for its lack of accountability. Careful examination of these confrontations reveals that they are superficial, they are ephemeral. The serious confrontation, the crisis which might imply an end to monarchy or require royal abdication, has never come, it may never come. The most that can be argued is that the monarchy has shown itself to be an institution that learns. Before Queen Elizabeth acceded to the throne in 1952, Great Britain and its empire had lived through the mortal conflict of 2 world wars and the monumental reconfiguration of the constitution and the economy which followed them. The first 50 years of her reign have seen the extraordinary expansion of cheap travel, the consequences of immigration on British life and politics, the manifold intrusions of the media into the homes of people from all social classes, the spread of consumerism, the collapse of heavy industry, and the rapid spread of the technical sophistication of information and communication systems. The world of 2002 is a global world in the intense interdependence of its markets, its scientific research, and its communications, unknown in 1952. In 1952, 80 to 90% of British people believed in the existence of God or some personal force. In 2002, a respectable figure for the proportion of the believing population is less than 50%. In 1952, 1 out of every 4 children died before reaching the age of 5. In 2002, fewer than 2% die each year, and they die of congenital diseases or they are victims of the heretofore incurable. The transformation in the power of medicine has been achieved as part of a more general shift from the deeper human vulnerability to changes in technology and social institutions, permanently offering the promise of a more comfortable living. However, there is certainly no historic decline in public interest in the Queen or in her family. Indeed, the public examination of Queen Elizabeth's character and behavior has always been powerful. Parents have confidently associated the persisting popularity with the phenomenon of modern public relations, with the growth of television and new forms of press. But, reflecting on Her Majesty the Queen as she will pass them by, it has been necessary to examine more arguments than the King of TV theory provides. Throughout her reign, Queen Elizabeth II has used her status to play a role in world affairs in a way her predecessors would not have dared. She has welcomed more than 100 foreign heads of state to her London residence, Buckingham Palace. The accompanying state banquets alone have seen her greet thousands of guests from nearly 135 countries. Often these state banquets signify a historic rapprochement with nations the UK had previously considered hostile. The Queen exemplified the British monarchy's adaptability and diplomatic reach, forging intercultural ties between nations thanks to her guests who were consistently over many years some of the most powerful and influential leaders in the world. Ironically, the Queen's state visit to the Republic of Ireland in 2011, the first visit to the Republic by a British monarch since Ireland won its independence, marked a significant breakthrough in UK-Irish relations. Her message of reconciliation in the Garden of Remembrance in Dublin's Parnell Square, where Republican dead are commemorated, who fought against British rule in Ireland, moved even her detractors to see her as a healer of historical wounds. Her subsequent tours to the Republic, the last of which was in 2014, demonstrated the Anglo-Irish defrost with poignancy. This would have been unimaginable a century ago. Her international role has always included close relations with many other sovereigns, and she has been an indefatigable participant in many international organizations. Her circle of international friends is a who's who of the great and the good, from the mid to late 20th century until now. Diplomatic relations and state visits. The Queen's role as a diplomat can also be measured in a series of state visits. As the Elizabethans expanded the Queen's travel ambitions, there were more of these country visits between 1952 and 2022 than during the whole of her father's reign. The reaction of international diplomacy to this factor of state-to-state contact is significant. The protests against the monarch's presence in South Africa in 1947 became both notable and rare occasions of anti-British and anti-monarchic feeling in the 20th century. Since acknowledgements of the Ling-Along have dried up, a number of Americans will still say that it was not the British monarch in 1939, but the big royal brand that mixed up their republic with the Nazis. After 2004, President Park Chung-hee went to the Olympic Games in Athens as an officially unaccompanied head of state, but that was because of the animosity of the then Labour government towards South Korea, brought on by its support for the invasion of Iraq. By contrast, when President Richard Nixon turned up in Chairman Mao's China in February 1972, the whole of the West gasped with the drama of the meeting, the freshness of the alliance, and the courting and opposition that were likely to be unleashed in the region in the coming years. The majority of the state visits by Queen Elizabeth in her first decade were to the countries of the Commonwealth or former colonial possessions that were charting their post-colonial futures. It was almost as though she was conducting another layer of post-colonial diplomacy, creating a world image of a still valuable and still noble monarchy that might give the former possessions a way to ride out the difficulties of the emerging European colonies in Africa, the Caribbean and Asia. British soft diplomacy in support of Britain's growing status and value as an old Western ally added value to that philanthropic purpose. Queen Elizabeth II's cultural influence. In an essay, it is explained that Queen Elizabeth often signed telegrams to people who had reached 100 years. Her office would send congratulatory telegrams. A list of suggestions for those thinking of sending such messages includes the royals' traditional sign-off Elizabeth R on the message or printing a facsimile of her signature. Throughout her 70-year reign, Queen Elizabeth II's cultural influence was enormous, particularly in the early days of her reign. That society-defining moment that coined a generation when millions first watched the coronation set the tone for the Queen's commitment to public service, something she was to renew at every Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting from her first in 1953 until her last in 2022. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was the patron or sponsor of thousands of organizations and charities, and in her life attended 22,222 larger gatherings. More than half of these, 13,268, were official engagements in the UK, with 4,490 of them, one-third, taking place in Greater London or the home counties. Her support was instrumental in setting the cultural tone for her reign and solidifying her popularity and legitimacy. Her relationship with top-flight literature is perhaps most obvious through the process of nobiliary tango, but it is impossible to understand British writing of the second half of the 20th and the turn of the 21st century without taking into consideration regular sightings of the monarch. Associations guarantee benefaction, and a handful of writers could boast of the sovereign's favour. The Queen never wrote to poets. Arts and patronage. British monarchy. There could be no better illustration of how Elizabeth II has helped to shape the artistic life of this country than in the huge and growing numbers of arts and other organizations she now kindly patronizes. These range from the revered authenticity of the Academy of Ancient Music to the always slightly risque Other Palace, where new musicals' earliest performances are honed. The sacred music of the Monteverdi choir is, in its own way, as far from the idea of a national queen as we can currently imagine, whereas the participation of Niall McDiarmid in a summer competition with children to depict the joy of school holidays was clearly something an artist with his roots in public spaces and the clubs of his home city of Portsmouth could not resist. In a career retrospective, he said, "I'm interested in individuals and in showing the little stories in the big city that don't get much of a voice." Once upon a time, real artists wore sackcloth and camped underground. Today they're made CBEs. It is impossible for figures for attendance or spending to capture the huge urgency accorded to royal events. For arts companies, giving added value by inviting performers to tea with the Queen can boost numbers, but posterity is also affected. The various Tate revivals gave Elizabeth a lavish, almost living tribute. Only a fortnight ago, Elizabeth almost single-handedly reversioned Scotland's most prolix theatre festival under her own banner. Her every public appearance is picked over for significance. Monarchs cannot always be on the right side of history. Queen Victoria's favourite artist typically depicted all her two infant children with blonde, straight, curious eyes. He was a pedophile and died in debt. Queen Lilibet's steady promotion of contemporary art, here and in hiding wherever she has gone, can transform the arts establishment's bluntly awkward, unpatriotic resistance towards all things modern. In the earlier 20th century, if anything wasn't either naturalistic or religious, you could just forget about it, rather than the royal family having a traditional artistic proclivity. Britain's art is, thanks to Elizabeth, continuing to reveal that her family prefers quiet portraits of aging skulls for aesthetic pleasure.